actually believed that in his heart of hearts, Darwin had become an atheist. And so for him, he couldn't imagine how God could allow there to be pain and suffering in the world, how the world looks to be so cruel. And so for him, the theory of evolution, where that mechanism supplanted the creator, was his solution to the problem of evil.
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by a special guest who's no stranger to the Jude 3 Project. He was on a few months ago, Dr. Fazale Rana. Welcome, Dr. Rana.
Lisa, it's so wonderful to have you, or to be with you, I should say, and to have a chance to spend time with you. And please call me Fuzz.
Okay. All right, Fuzz. For those who didn't see you the time before, just give them a little bit of background.
Yeah, well, I currently work for a ministry called Reasons to Believe, and the focus of our ministry is to show how the latest discoveries in science provide evidence for God's existence and the reliability of Scripture. I'm a biochemist by training, and this idea of using science as a way to build a bridge to the gospel is really very important to me, because it was my work in biochemistry as a graduate student that convinced me that there had to be a creator. At that point, I was an agnostic until going to graduate school, and it was the reality of the evidence for a creator's existence that opened me up to hearing the gospel. So, I believe that science, because it has such a strong influence in our world today, because so many people respect the pronouncements of science, can be a very powerful connecting point to the gospel in a day and age where technology reigns supreme.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. I love your work because people think faith and science are at odds, and you show how they actually work together. So that's very, very helpful to the body of Christ. Today, we're going to be talking about Darwin. It was Darwin Day yesterday, which I wasn't aware of, until your team sent me an email about Darwin Day. Can you explain to our audience what Darwin Day is?
Yeah, well, Darwin Day is a day where typically on university campuses around the world, people celebrate the birth of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was born February 12th, 1809. And in 2009, that was the 150th anniversary of the publication of Origins of Species, where Darwin lays out his theory of evolution. It was also the 200th anniversary of his birth. And so in honor of those milestones, there were these worldwide celebrations of Darwin, the man, the scientist, and his legacy. And that has continued to this very day, where, again, typically on university campuses, biology departments will instigate these Darwin Day celebrations, which is a way, again, to promote Darwin's scientific legacy. And so for many people, Darwin's theory of evolution and biological evolution in a broader sense represents a challenge to the Christian faith, or represents a challenge to the idea that God exists, because many people reason, look, if evolutionary mechanisms can explain the origin and the design and the history of life, well, then why do you need a creator? And in fact, when I was an undergraduate student, that was kind of the mentality I had. I accepted the evolutionary paradigm. I was an agnostic. And so when people would share their faith with me, it just didn't have an impact, because to me, why do you need to appeal to a creator? And I meet so many people that adopt that mindset. So it's very important, I think, as Christians to be aware of these kind of Darwin Day celebrations, and to be willing to offer a response or a counter narrative to this idea that mechanism alone can explain life and a creator is not needed.
Awesome. So give a brief picture of what Darwin had available to work with when he wrote The Origin of Species, and maybe a bit about the man himself.
Yeah, well, Darwin is a fascinating historical figure. He had a very interesting upbringing In fact, he was a medical school dropout. It wasn't because he couldn't intellectually handle medicine. It was he didn't like the gore associated with cutting into human bodies. And he actually, at his father's urging, studied Christian theology at the university. So he was trained to be a clergyman. I don't know if many people realize that.
Oh, wow.
And then he was self-taught as a scientist, as a naturalist, and his family was independently wealthy, and so he was like a gentleman scientist in those days. Very interesting figure who had also he struggled with a lifelong illness that was debilitating. His wife Emma Darwin was a very strong Christian influence in the household and in the community. So a very interesting person who became very angry at God with the death of his daughter Anne, who was 10 years old and died. And that death really catalyzed Darwin to produce the book On the Origin of Species, where he lays out his theory of biological evolution. But when Darwin wrote Origins of Species, interestingly enough, most of what we know today that constitutes modern biology was unknown to Darwin. For example, Darwin had no idea how inheritance took place. We hadn't discovered genes as of yet when Darwin wrote his Origin of Species. Darwin's view of the cell was that it was a blob of jelly surrounded by a cell envelope, that it wasn't very complex. Darwin had really no appreciation for the history of life on Earth. So he was really operating in a knowledge vacuum to a large degree when he wrote Origins of Species. And so a few years ago, my colleague Hugh Ross and I wrote a little booklet called What Darwin Didn't Know, where we just kind of asked the fun question, if Darwin knew today, if Darwin knew then what we know today about biology, would he have advanced this theory of evolution?
Mm-hmm. And that leads to my next question. What do you think the two most significant scientific facts that if Darwin had known might have greatly impacted his theory?
Yeah, well, that's those are fun questions to speculate about. And it's interesting, when Darwin wrote on the Origin of Species, he had an entire chapter devoted to difficulties with his theory. And so these were places where he realized that there were features of nature that didn't line up with what he would have expected if indeed his theory was valid. And so Darwin was intellectually honest in pointing out those difficulties with his theory. And those are great places to start in terms of asking the question, if Darwin knew then what we know now, would he have advanced this theory? One thing that Darwin lamented about was the way the fossil record looked, the patterns in the fossil record. Because Darwin expected that evolution would happen gradually. Well, if that was the case, then the fossil record should show gradual evolutionary transformations. It should show a lot of transitional forms. But instead, what the fossil record in Darwin's day showed were that groups would appear suddenly without any kind of history preceding them in an evolutionary sense. And then they would remain unchanged or static before they would disappear from the fossil record. So that troubled Darwin. But in addition to that, Darwin was aware of something called what we now call today the Cambrian explosion. And this is an event in life's history where out of nowhere, complex animals show up suddenly in the fossil record. These are called the Cambrian strata. And beneath those strata or rocks, there's nothing. There's no evolutionary history. Then suddenly this explosion of animal forms takes place. And Darwin was very troubled by that. Well, what's interesting is Darwin said, look, if we continue to collect more fossils and study geological layers, these problems are going to evaporate. That's what he wrote in The Origin of Species. Well, it's interesting, 160 years later, the fossil record in terms of its pattern still looks the same. Things show up suddenly in the fossil record, they remain unchanged, and then they disappear. There's a dearth of transitional intermediate forms, and the Cambrian explosion looks like it's a real event. that today defies evolutionary explanation. So when you just look at the difficulties that Darwin identified, and realize that those difficulties persist today, that to me is reason, I think, if you're a thinking person, to be skeptical of maybe the grand claim that evolution can explain everything in biology.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful. For those who are listening, what is the Miller-Urey experiment, and why is it still in our textbooks?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that Darwin wrote about, he didn't write about this in Origin of Species, but he wrote about this in a letter to one of his friends named Joseph Hooker, where he speculated that maybe life originated in a warm little pond, where he envisioned chemicals in this environment where some kind of energy source would catalyze the reaction of those chemicals to form the very first cells. So he applied, in a sense, his theory of evolution to molecules, saying that this is how the very first life forms could originate. And of course, at that time, Darwin viewed the cell as, again, this protoplasm, this very simple jelly-like material with a cell wall surrounding it. And so it's very easy to see how Darwin could think that maybe something like a cell could emerge through that mechanism. Well, into the 1920s, a Russian biochemist by the name of Alexander Oparin and a British geneticist by the name of J.B.S. Haldane, both gentlemen were atheists, by the way, took Darwin's idea of a warm little pond, and they basically produced an elaborate chemical pathway in which they thought life could originate. Along comes Stanley Miller in the 1950s. And he does this famous experiment that you probably have seen in your biology textbook, Lisa. It's this glass apparatus where Miller was trying to mimic the conditions of the early Earth. And he had a flask of boiling water. And in the headspace, he had hydrogen and ammonia and methane, and had this continuous electrical discharge going through the headspace. And lo and behold, he was able to produce amino acids, which are the building blocks that are used to make proteins. And so it looked as if Miller essentially validated Darwin's idea of this warm little pond. Well, lo and behold, this, again, experiment was done in the 1950s. Probably by the late 1990s, planetary scientists realized that the conditions that Miller used in this Miller-Urey experiment were not the conditions that actually existed on the early Earth. So instead of ammonia and methane and water, the atmosphere looks to be nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and water. And that gas mix will not produce anything in a Miller-Urey experiment. Nothing forms. And so people now consider that experiment to be irrelevant to the origin of life, but yet it still shows up in biology textbooks as this illustration that even evolution can explain the origin of life. And I think it's significant to note that today, most people who are in the scientific community, particularly people that work on the origin of life problem, many who are atheists will agree we have no explanation for the origin of life. So this is one of those examples where these ideas still remain in textbooks, though they shouldn't really be there any longer. It's maddening to see that. But it's just part of the package that we have to deal with, I think, as Christians.
Mm-hmm. That's very good that you pointed out that, because I think as we are navigating this and students are going off to college and even in high school and middle school reading books, the assumption is that this stuff is credible especially as it relates to science. And you pointing that out, I think it's helpful because so many students are intimidated by their professors or what's in their books. And so when it comes to faith, they kind of surrender their faith because of the information. But I think you pointing that out, I think is very important and helpful for us to know that we have the ability to challenge what's written in our scientific textbooks as believers. So thank you for sharing that. In your opinion, do you think that if Darwin was alive today and had the science available to him, that he be as committed to his original theory of Darwinist evolutions as the Darwinist evolutionists are. I'm sorry, getting stuck on that last line there.
Yeah. I think Darwin would have still advanced his theory of evolution, because what Darwin was trying to do with his theory of evolution was not just simply answer a scientific question, namely, how do you explain the origin of species? He was actually trying to in a sense, modernize biology, at least in his mind, because in the early 1800s, most people that worked in biology saw design in nature, in biological systems, as the handiwork of a creator. So biology was a teleological enterprise. And what I mean by that, it was built around the concept of design, where the design that we saw in biology was real design, again, the creator's handiwork. And in a sense, biology was unique among the scientific disciplines, because every other scientific discipline at that time was based on mechanism and materialistic explanations. This was true for physics and for chemistry, astronomy, and geology. And so what Darwin did with his theory of evolution was he had now a mechanism that could not only explain the origin of species, but according to Darwin, could explain the origin of major groups, could even account for the design that you see in biology, where evolutionary mechanisms became the blind watchmaker, replacing William Paley's divine watchmaker. So Darwin moved biology into this mechanistic arena. That's why people refer to it as the Darwinian revolution. But also Darwin was doing something else. And remember, I said that he wrote Origin of Species after the death of his daughter, Anne. Well, Darwin, even though he was trained as a clergyman, gradually lost his faith. And what kind of was the final trigger was the death of his daughter, Anne. Now, when you read Darwin's writings, he at times will use religious language. But I think that was just simply a nod on his part to the fact that there were people of religious sensibilities that he didn't want to offend. But I think I actually believe that in his heart of hearts, Darwin had become an atheist. And so for him, he couldn't imagine how God could allow there to be pain and suffering in the world, how the world looks to be so cruel. And so for him, the theory of evolution, where that mechanism supplanted the creator, was his solution to the problem of evil. And I meet, so many people that are atheists today, and their complaint is that how could there be a creator if there's so much pain and suffering in the world? And many times they're not even referring to human pain and suffering. They will just turn to nature and say, nature just looks to be red in tooth and claw, to quote Alfred Lord Tennyson. And so Darwin was in that category. In fact, he wrote a letter to a friend of his named Asa Gray, who was a botanist at Harvard University. And Asa Gray was one of the first scientists in America to embrace Darwin's theory of evolution. Asa Gray was also a Presbyterian and a very committed Christian. And he wrote Darwin this question: could God have used evolution to create? And Darwin rejected that idea out of hand, because he couldn't imagine how a creator could use evolution to create when he saw the world in nature being so cruel. In fact, he wrote these words, these famous words: what a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, blundering, horribly low works of nature. And so Darwin couldn't even see how God could use evolution as a way to create. So I think Darwin would have advanced his theory of evolution because it's not just a scientific explanation for origins. It's essentially kind of forcing biology into this framework where only materialistic explanations are allowed. It removes any kind of evidence or signature of design from creation, and it serves as a solution for Darwin and for many other people as a solution to the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so helpful because as I remember in class one time in undergrad, I was going back and forth with my professor, and there was a kind of an outburst of why did God allow, I think, my daughter to have Down syndrome. And so the response, while the conversation had been a lot of kind of logic and philosophy, when it got down to the core, it was a kind of an emotional issue at the root of it, and it was kind of masked by philosophical ideologies. And so to think about Darwin's daughter Anne, and that was kind of the straw that that kind of brought all this to fruition in his mind, him trying to really solve the problem of evil is really at the core of a lot of conversations I think we're having with people who are atheists or agnostic, them wrestling with real pain and navigating through the questions about science, but then also getting to the core of why they believe or why they're struggling with the belief in God. Do you see that regularly on college campuses as well?
Oh, yes, all the time. I mean, the number one response to any kind of design argument would be to try to point out features in nature that look like they are poorly designed. And the objection is a creator would never do that. And that's essentially a variation of the problem of evil. But as you've so perceptively pointed out, Lisa, there's usually something that is a deep-seated emotional hurt that people have, where they're angry at God in the same way that Darwin was angry at God, and then as a result could only make sense of that if God just simply didn't exist. And so, the interesting thing is, when we talk about the use of science as a way to build a bridge to the gospel, or use of science to defend the truth claims of the Christian faith, many of the arguments that we would make are ultimately philosophical arguments, and many of the objections to the arguments are ultimately philosophical and theological objections. And so for people that are a little intimidated by using science in apologetics and Christian apologetics, the thing to keep in mind is that science just is the veneer. What really is going on at the end of the day are theological and philosophical discussions. And so when people realize that, then I think they're much better able to appropriately use science without being intimidated by all the scientific jargon. If you just understand the scientific concepts and how they feed into the philosophical arguments, you can go a long way to using science to make a case for a creator. But then when you realize it all boils down at the end of the day to the problem of evil, that you have to be equipped philosophically, theologically, and biblically to answer that question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. I'm combing through your book, and I think this is a question that I want to ask you before we close out, because I think a lot of people see these visuals and don't know what they mean. Who were the hominids?
Okay, well, the hominids are these creatures that appear in the fossil record. Creatures like Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Lucy, that people are probably familiar with those nicknames. And for many people, they would view those as being essentially evolutionary transitional forms documenting the evolutionary origin of humanity. But one way that I would view those creatures as a old Earth creationist is that these were real creatures that existed, but that they were creatures that were created by God, that existed and then went extinct, that they had some limited intelligence and emotional capability, but they lacked a quality that only human beings have, and that is the image of God. So that's how I view the hominids from an old Earth creationist perspective. But many people will look at them and say, well, this is very compelling evidence for human evolution. But the fact of the matter is, every one of those hominins that we typically see in that ascent of man imagery, right? Almost every one of them, actually, not almost all of them, but every one of them are evolutionary side branches and dead ends, even if you view them from an evolutionary standpoint. So most anthropologists think Neanderthals didn't evolve into humans. They question whether or not Homo erectus was part of the human or lineage. people don't know where Lucy fits. And so the fact of the matter is you cannot draw this pathway through the hominin fossil record and show a very clear evolutionary trajectory that leads to the origin of humanity. The fossil record doesn't really show that whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. I think that's definitely very helpful. For those who want to know more about this topic, obviously you're going to recommend your book. And then is there any other resources on your website that they could take a look at as well?
You know, if people want to get into this whole question of can evolution explain the origin, the history, and the design of life, the best thing to do is probably go to our website at reasons.org. And there are just tons of articles that we've written. There's podcasts, there's videos that people can start to sample and get some familiarity with, the topic before they necessarily feel like they have to invest money to buy books. Not that I'm discouraging people from buying the books that we write, but I think it's a great place to start is just to begin to sample some of the articles, and keep in mind that when you start to sample the articles, you're kind of in the middle of a conversation. So there'll be a little bit of catch up that you'll have to engage in, but that's probably the best way to start.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to leave without recommending this book, What Darwin Didn't Know, because it's helpful in dealing with what we just talked about to give you a little bit more in depth. Where can they get that book?
Well, they can get that book if they go to our website at reasons.org. But actually, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to do this. I'm going to do this anyway. If people scroll down on our website, reasons.org, towards the bottom, there's a microphone, and above it, there's a caption that says a free gift for you. If people click on that and give us their contact information, we will email your listeners and your viewers a free PDF copy of that book. It's just a short little booklet, but we'll send them a free PDF copy of that booklet. So that's our gift to your listeners and your viewers.
Awesome. I thank you for that. I think they're going to enjoy it, and I think it's helpful as we have parents that listen to this that are struggling to navigate this topic with their children. We have millennials and Gen Z listening, trying to navigate with school. So I think this will be an excellent resource for them. And I thank you for taking the time to be with us today. How can people get in contact with you on social media?
Yeah, if I've got both a public figure and a personal Facebook page that I maintain, so people can just search my name on Facebook or on Twitter. I should probably write. I never can remember my Twitter and my Facebook handles, but if they just search my name, they'll find me, or they can go to RTB_official on Facebook or Twitter, and through there they can find how they can connect with me on Facebook and Twitter. But I'm pretty active on social media. I try to be anyway, and so people can find me that way.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Fuzz. I really appreciate you coming back to talk to us.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm really honored.